Today we're going to be doing endocrine system. So as a little review over the endocrine system, the endocrine system and nervous system will work together to integrate and coordinate activities of all cells throughout the body. The major roles it will be doing is it's going to influence metabolic activities by means of hormones being transported in the blood. Its responses are going to be slower, but in general longer lasting than nervous system type responses. And the major glands that we're going to go through are going to be your pineal gland, the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland with the parathyroid, the 4 parathyroid glands that are just posterior to it, your adrenal glands, and we'll go through the gonads too. So hormones are going to be chemical messengers. There's going to be different things. We have hormones which will travel a long distance and they'll signal cells that are going to travel, or they're going to travel through the blood or the lymph, and they're going to signal cells and tell them to increase or decrease some sort of activity. There's two other things that we have called autocrines and paracrines. Autocrines are going to be chemicals that will have an effect on the tissue that secretes them. Paracrines will be chemicals that are going to act locally, but it's not going to affect the tissue that is secreting it. Autocrines and paracrines, they are considered what's called a local messenger, and they're not part of the endocrine system. Within our hormones, there's going to be two major classes. There are the amino acid based hormones and the steroidal based hormones. Within the amino acid based hormones, there's going to be amines, thyroxines, peptides, and proteins. And then within the steroidal, these guys are going to be synthesized from cholesterols. And then we'll also have our gonadal and adrenal cortical hormones. On your study guide, I'm asking for the 4 types of hormones. I think it's like the first thing that I ask on there. These are the 4 types that I'm looking for you guys. With the mechanisms of how hormones work, they can change a plasma membrane's permeability by opening or closing some sort of channel. They can stimulate the synthesis of protein or some sort of regulatory molecule that will, once again, it can change the plasma membrane permeability, or it can change the overall activity of the cell. They can activate or deactivate enzyme systems. They can induce secretory activity, so they can cause cells to release their contents. Or they can stimulate mitosis of a cell division. Oops. With hormones, there's going to be 2 actions, 2 ways they're going to affect the cell. We have our water-soluble hormones, which are going to be all hormones except for our steroid and thyroid hormones. These guys cannot just enter the cell. What they will do is they will affect the plasma membrane of a cell, and they'll couple with G proteins, and that's going to be the way they'll affect the inside of the cell. With lipid-soluble hormones, these guys just dissolve straight through the cell membrane. They get into the cell, and there will be intracellular receptors. Water-soluble hormones, typically extracellular receptors. These guys, typically intracellular receptors. If they're going to have intracellular receptors, the water-soluble ones, they'll couple with G proteins. It's an intracellular secondary messenger. Okay, so here's our steroid hormone. This is outside the cell. This light blue line represents the cell membrane, and then here's the inside of the cell. So you have your steroid hormone. It diffuses through the cell membrane or plasma membrane. It meets up with its receptor. It can go into the nucleus of the cell, and it can tell the cell, hey, take this do this, make some mRNA, make some new protein, make whatever I need you to make, or do whatever I want you to do. There's going to be, with target cells, they will be very, very specific to which hormones will interact with them. Okay, so each cell will have specific receptors. If a hormone that comes along and it doesn't interact with that receptor, it doesn't affect that cell. So for example, ACTH hormones are only going to be found on certain cells of the adrenal cortex, nowhere else in the body. So if we increase the levels of ACTH, is an adrenal corticotropic hormone, it's only found in our adrenal cortex receptors for it. So if we raise our ACTH levels, it won't affect anything in the body other than the adrenal cortex. Now, the hormones released by the adrenal cortex, that's a different story. They can affect a whole host of other things. Or, for example, thyroxine, thyroid hormone, one of our thyroid hormones, these receptors are going to be all over the body in most all cells. Target cell activation is going to depend on three major factors. One, the relative blood levels of the hormone. Two, the number of receptors in or on the target cell. And three, the affinity of binding between the receptor and hormone. These can all be changed based on your environment. So you can either increase or decrease, release the level of the hormone. The receptors can be upregulated or downregulated. So if we upregulate, that means that the cells will form more receptors. If we downregulate, that means the cells will lose receptors. And then the affinity of binding will be correlated with the environment. Like, is the blood pH optimal? Are you too cold? Are you too warm? Stuff like that. So with our control of our hormones, blood levels, they're going to be controlled via negative feedback mechanisms. In general, hormonal levels are controlled by negative feedback mechanisms. There's a few cases where we use a positive feedback mechanism, and the main ones coming to mind right now are going to be menstruation and childbirth. And you want to keep these levels within a very, very narrow range. Hormones are going to be synthesized and released in response to one of three ways: either a humoral stimulus, such as blood levels of some sort of ion; a neural stimuli, so some sort of nerve is connected to the gland, it stimulates it, it tells the gland to release it; or hormonal stimuli. Hormone is one tissue releases a hormone that goes to another tissue to tell that tissue to release its end product hormone. So humoral stimuli, changing levels of ions and nutrients, directly stimulates the secretion of hormones. For example, if you get low concentrations of calcium in the blood is flowing by our parathyroid glands. We sense low levels of calcium in the blood. Parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone increases osteoclastic activity, and our calcium levels rise. So calcium levels rise high enough, that causes us to stop the release of parathyroid hormone. So that's our negative feedback or teeter-totter type of mechanism there. Neural stimuli. There will be a nerve that goes specifically into that tissue, and when it stimulates the tissue releases its hormone. For example, you get your sympathetic fibers that will end in the adrenal medulla. Okay? When you get a sympathetic response, it causes the medulla to release its catecholamines, or its hormones. Those are called epinephrine and norepinephrine, and those will have their lasting effects. And then lastly is hormonal. Lots of stuff works via hormonal ways too. So the best example is the anterior pituitary, and it's releasing and it's stimulating hormones. So it can stimulate the thyroid gland, the adrenal cortex, or the testes, or gonads, so testes or ovaries. So we can release thyroid stimulating hormones. So first off, we have the hypothalamus, which releases something called thyroid releasing hormone, which tells the anterior pituitary to release this thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. So can you see we have two steps there where hormones telling anterior pituitary to release its hormones, and then the anterior pituitary hormones are telling the thyroid gland to release its hormones. So that would be a great example of a hormonal type of stimulus. With our nervous system modulation, the nervous system is going to modify the stimulation of endocrine glands and their negative feedback mechanism. All right, the best example is under stress, the hypothalamus and the sympathetic nervous system get activated, and what will happen is overall your blood glucose levels are going to rise. All right, so here we're going to be checking out the action of the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is considered a downgrowth of the hypothalamic nervous tissue. So this is just a downgrowth of the hypothalamus. Up here we have nuclei of our hypothalamus, and then we're going to have long axons coming out. The nuclei are going to produce oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, and then down here in their axon terminals, that oxytocin and antidiuretic are going to be stored. So hypothalamic neurons synthesize, I'm over here in the blue reading this too, synthesize oxytocin and ADH. Oxytocin and ADH are going to be transported along this hypothalamic hypophyseal tract to the posterior pituitary gland. It's just going to be nerves traveling down here, axons traveling down here. Oxytocin and ADH are going to get stored in these axon terminals, and oxytocin and ADH are going to be released if these hypothalamic neurons fire. So these fire, we release the hormones into the blood, they have their ongoing effect. Oxytocin is going to have a couple things it does. First off, it is going to help out with uterine contractions during childbirth. It will trigger milk letdown post-childbirth. And it will play a role in sexual arousal and orgasm for both males and females. Antidiuretic. Diuretics make you urinate, right? So antidiuretics do the exact opposite. They stop urination. You'll have osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, and what they will do is they will see is blood concentration of stuff getting too high. Is your blood pressure dropping, or do you have too much stuff in your blood? If it is getting high, you release ADH, antidiuretic hormone. You soak up more water, you decrease the osmolarity of your blood. You increase your blood pressure. A strong inhibitor of ADH is antidiuretic. Is alcohol. If you drink, so alcohol will inhibit the release of ADH, and that'll cause you to urinate. So when you drink, that's the reason why you have to pee a lot, is that the alcohol is stopping the release of antidiuretic, anti-pee hormone. So the result is you start to urinate. Now we're looking at the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland is still going to be stimulated by the hypothalamus, but what happens is the hypothalamus releasing hormones into what's called the hypophyseal portal system. So hypothalamus releases its releasing hormones come into the anterior pituitary, and they tell it to release whatever hormone. So if I release thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, that tells me to release thyroid stimulating hormone, or there'd be follicular releasing hormone or adrenocorticotropic releasing hormone, so stuff like that. When appropriately stimulated, hypothalamic neurons secrete releasing and inhibiting neurons into the primary capillary plexus. So releasing hormones will stimulate release of our anterior pituitary hormones. The inhibiting hormones will inhibit the release. Hypothalamic hormones travel through the portal veins to the anterior pituitary, where they stimulate or inhibit the release of hormones. Anterior pituitary hormones are going to be secreted into the secondary capillary plexus, and they go on their way to the rest of the body. So the anterior pituitary hormones are growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicular stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. So first and foremost, what we're going to talk about is growth hormone. Growth hormone does just what it says. It stimulates growth. It's going to stimulate most cells, but specifically bone and skeletal muscle, and it's going to promote protein synthesis, and it's going to encourage the use of fats. So this is, think of that statement right there. It stimulates protein synthesis and encourages the use of fats as fuel. Does that make sense why athletes want to use this? They want to decrease their body fat and increase their muscle tone, so it causes muscle cells to build and break down a fat. Growth hormone is going to be regulated by growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. GHRH causes growth hormone to get released. GHIH causes growth hormone to stop being released. If you have too much growth hormone released, you would have hypersecretion of growth hormone, and in children that causes gigantism, so they'd be a very, very large person. In adults, there's something called acromegaly. In children, if you have decreased secretion, you get what is called hyposecretion, and that is pituitary dwarfism, so they would be likely to be a dwarf. So we release our growth hormone, its effects, it's going to tell skeletal tissue to increase bone growth. So for example, like Sammy Sosa, he was a big strong guy, he took growth hormone and his hat size went up like 2 sizes when he was in his 30s. Your bones don't grow anymore when you're in your 30s. The reason why, he was taking growth hormone. His head grew. Also what happened with him though is he had increased protein synthesis of skeletal muscle, so his muscles grew. He had increased breakdown of fat, so he became leaner. Okay, and then it also will increase glucose and other anti-insulin effects. Next one we have here is our thyroid stimulating hormone. It's going to stimulate the normal development and secretory activity of the thyroid gland. So basically what we have here is we have the hypothalamus. It releases its thyroid releasing hormone, which tells the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, which tells your thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. As the thyroid hormones are released, they inhibit the release of TSH and they inhibit the release of TRH, so it's kind of a nice negative feedback mechanism. If our thyroid levels go low, then we start to release thyroid releasing hormone, which tells us to release the thyroid stimulating hormone again, and it will cause our thyroid hormone to rise. Next is our adrenocorticotropic hormones, or our corticotropin. These are going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to release its corticosteroids. These are going to be regulated. These are going to regulate the release of, these are going to be regulated by corticotropic releasing hormone, and it's going to have its normal rhythm. It'll have like a circadian rhythm. It'll have its ups and downs throughout the day. It can also be affected by internal and external factors such as fever, hypoglycemia, and stress, daily stresses. If your stress levels increase and they stay increased for a long time, it can alter the release of CRH. With your gonadotropins, you're going to have FSH and LH. FSH is going to stimulate eggs or sperm to begin the production, or to begin their maturation process. LH is going to promote the release of gonadal hormones, such as estrogen or testosterone. These guys are going to be controlled by the release of gonadotropic releasing hormone, and they will be controlled via a negative feedback mechanism. Prolactin is going to stimulate milk production in mothers post-baby or postpartum, and prolactin is going to be controlled by prolactin inhibiting hormone. If we're not releasing prolactin inhibiting hormone, we begin the production of prolactin. All right. So blood levels rise. The blood levels of prolactin start to rise towards the end of pregnancy. Once childbirth occurs, you are postpartum. The prolactin levels rise, and suckling will stimulate the release of prolactin releasing hormone, and that will promote the release or the continued release of prolactin, and it will continue milk production. Pro-opiomelanocortin, POMC. It's a prohormone. It's going to be a source of adrenocorticotropic hormone. There's two types. These are basically your happy hormones. There's endorphins and metenkephalons. That's the gist of what I want you to know about them. They're your happy hormones. Okay, with your thyroid gland, there's going to be two lateral lobes connected by an isthmus. If we look inside of these lobes, we will have these fluid-filled centers or colloid-filled follicles, and around them there are follicular cells. Also, you will have some parafollicular cells. So these would be parafollicular cells, the cells that are not actually around the follicle, they're outside of the follicular cells. The parafollicular cells produce calcitonin, and our follicular cells produce thyroid hormone, T3 and T4. Inside of this colloid-filled follicle, we're going to have what's called thyroglobulin and iodine. These are going to be precursors for our thyroid hormone, so our follicular cells can suck that stuff up and use it to make the hormone. So with your thyroid hormone, there's going to be two related compounds. There is thyroxine and there is triiodothyronine. Thyroxine has 2 tyrosine molecules and 4 iodine, so T4 for 4 iodine. T3 is going to have 2 tyrosine and 3 iodines bound to it, so that is T3. These are going to be our major metabolic hormones, and they're going to be there to increase metabolic rate and heat production. The major role these will be playing is maintenance of blood pressure, tissue growth, skeletal nervous system development, and reproduction. These are going to be controlled through a negative feedback mechanism. Basically, the way it's going to work is thyroid hormones, as they rise, they are going to prevent the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, and they are going to prevent the release of thyroid releasing hormone. As thyroid levels tail off, they are going to cause the release of thyroid releasing hormone, which causes the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, which causes the release of thyroid hormone. The effects of this negative feedback mechanism can be overcome in 2 situations: pregnancy or exposure to extreme cold. So with imbalances of thyroid hormone, you can have hyposecretion. So hypothyroidism would mean you have decreased thyroid gland secretion. Hypersecretion would mean you have increased secretion from the thyroid gland. An example of a disease from it could be Graves' disease, and one of the symptoms from it would be exophthalmos. So this person's eyes look like they're popping out of their head, and they typically would have wasting, and they'd be extremely skinny and jittery. With hyposecretion, you could have myxedema, or you could have a goiter. So this little boy has a goiter. The reason why they get a goiter is there's a lack of iodine, and the thyroid gland's trying to swell up because you're getting more thyroglobulin, but you're not getting any more iodine. Or you could have creatinism. Next is the calcitonin. It's going to be produced by the parafollicular cells. It is going to be the antagonist to parathyroid hormone. Its function will be to inhibit the activity and release of calcium from the bony matrix. It will stimulate the uptake of calcium by causing increased osteoblastic activity. Well, it doesn't increase osteoblastic activity, but well, it does, but it doesn't. So it will stimulate the uptake of calcium and incorporate it into the bony matrix. Big thing it's going to do is stop osteoclastic activity. It's going to be regulated by calcium levels, so it'll have a humoral regulation by calcium levels, and it'll be controlled via a negative feedback mechanism. With parathyroid glands, these guys are going to be posterior to the thyroid gland. They're 4 tiny little embedded glands posterior to the thyroid gland. They produce parathyroid hormone, which is going to be very important in calcium homeostasis. Parathyroid hormone is going to increase the activity of osteoclasts. As we increase the activity of osteoclasts, they break down bone, they release calcium. So, Functions: stimulate osteoclast to digest bony matrix. Alright, so let's say we have low calcium levels. I'm over on the right side of the page. We have low calcium levels. Our parathyroid will have receptors near here. They will sense low calcium levels. Our parathyroid glands will then release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone goes in the blood, goes to the bone, increases osteoclastic activity. We release calcium. Next thing it does, it goes to the kidney, and it is going to cause reabsorption of calcium. Kidney will filter out extra calcium. If you need it, you can reabsorb it and bring it back to the blood. And it'll also activate vitamin D to increase the absorption of calcium in the intestines. As calcium levels rise, we inhibit the release of parathyroid hormone. With our adrenal glands, these are going to be a pyramid-shaped organ. They sit on top of the kidneys. Kidneys are the renal system, so adrenal above the renal system. It's basically two glands in one. There's the adrenal medulla, which is going to be part of our sympathetic nervous system. There's going to be the adrenal cortex, which is going to be 3 layers of tissue that will secrete different corticosteroids. So with our adrenal cortex, there's going to be 3 parts to it. The zona glomerulosa, the outermost level. The zona fasciculata, which is the middle level of the cortex. And the zona reticularis. The zona glomerulosa produces our mineral corticoids, which are going to be affecting our sodium levels is the big thing. Our glucocorticoids are going to be affecting our glucose. Okay, that's going to be cortisol is the one we're going to talk about there. And then our gonatocorticoids are going to be the gonadotropins, so that'll be our estrogens and testosterones. So with our mineral corticoids, they're going to regulate electrolytes, primarily sodium and potassium. The big one that we'll talk about is aldosterone, and aldosterone is going to be the most potent mineral corticoid produced by the zona glomerulosa. It stimulates reabsorption of sodium and water by the kidneys. We go really in depth of how this works in the renal chapter, which is towards the end of AMP2 actually. So what happens if we get low blood pressure and low levels of sodium in the blood? We'll typically be having high levels of potassium. The kidney responds by releasing renin, which activates this renin-angiotensin mechanism, and then we get the end product of that is the stuff called angiotensin II. Angiotensin II affects the zona glomerulosa to release aldosterone, and aldosterone causes us to increase absorption of sodium, increase absorption of water, and increase excretion of potassium. What happens there? We increase our blood volume. Okay? We keep increasing blood volume, that causes increased blood pressure. If that keeps going up, then we want to start to drop the blood pressure. So we stop the release of this stuff by one of the chambers of one of the atria of the heart releasing atrionatriuretic peptide. It's going to be actually the right atrium of the heart will release some atrionatriuretic peptide, ANP, and that is going to have inhibitory effects on our release of aldosterone. So overall, we will decrease blood pressure and volume there with the release of ANP, atrionatriuretic peptide. Homeostatic imbalances of aldosterone. If you have aldosteronism. If you have hypersecretion, you can have hypertension and edema due to excess sodium in your blood and in your extracellular fluid, and increased excretion of potassium can lead to abnormal functioning of your muscles and your neurons. Next are glucocorticoids. The main one we're going to talk about is cortisol. It's going to keep our blood sugars relatively constant, and it's going to help with maintenance of blood pressure. This is also going to be affected by stress, our cortisol. So it's going to be released in response to ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone, your patterns of eating, and your stress level. If you have high levels of stress, you increase your levels of cortisol. Its prime metabolic effect is gluconeogenesis and formation of glucose from fats and proteins. It'll promote rises in blood glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids. If you get hypersecretion of our glucocorticoids or cortisol, it will depress cartilage and bone formation. It will stop inflammation. It will make your immune system decrease in function, and it will promote increased blood pressure, and actually will end up causing you to gain weight in the long run. Hyposecretion in Addison's disease is going to be deficits in mineral corticoids, so you'll get decreased amounts of it. You'll decrease your sodium and glucose levels, and you'll have weight loss, severe dehydration, and hypotension because of the severe dehydration. When people, so this is a normal healthy lady, this is the same lady, in the long run she ended up getting something called, she got the Cushing syndrome, and when people get Cushing syndrome, over time they get something called the buffalo hump, which is right here. So if you notice, she has weight gain, and she's got her little buffalo hump there. Okay, gonadocorticoids. Most are going to be androgens, which are the male sex hormones that are going to be converted to testosterone in tissue cells, or estrogens in males. They are believed to help with the onset of puberty, secondary sex characteristics, and sex drive. With the adrenal medulla, we said that it's going to be an extension of our sympathetic nervous system, so we'll have preganglionic sympathetic fibers that end in there. Alright, and they will have two things they're going to release: epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine is going to have a bunch of stuff it does. It's going to cause bronchodilation, increase blood flow to skeletal muscles in the heart, and it's going to increase metabolic activities. Norepinephrine is going to cause vasoconstriction, and it's going to cause your blood pressure to rise. Why? So you're ready to fight or flight. You get ready to take off and do whatever you need to do. The short-term response from these are going to be increased heart rate, increased blood pressure. The liver is going to convert glycogen to glucose, which will make glucose available in the blood, so you have a good energy source available so you can go do whatever you need to do. You'll have dilation of your bronchioles. You'll change the flow patterns of blood, so it's mainly going to skeletal tissue, so you can skeletal muscle, so you can do whatever you need to do, and it'll increase your metabolic rate. Over long term, what it's going to do is you're going to start getting release of your mineral and glucocorticoids. Your mineral corticoids are going to make you retain sodium and water. It's going to increase blood volume, which will in turn increase blood pressure. Your glucocorticoids are going to cause proteins and fats to get converted to protein, so they're going to be broken down to glucose, so they can be used for energy, and they're going to increase your blood glucose levels, and they will suppress your immune system. Pineal gland is going to be found hanging from the roof of the third ventricle. It is going to produce melatonin, which is derived from serotonin. It is going to affect timing of sexual maturation and puberty, and it is going to help with your sleep cycle too. The pancreas is going to be found, you can see the stomach would be like here, here's the duodenum, here's your pancreas. Your pancreas is going to have exocrine and endocrine functions. Its exocrine functions are going to be to produce enzyme-rich juices, and also it can produce bicarbonate, so we can increase absorption of nutrients in the gut. And then we're going to have these pancreatic isles, or isles of Langerhans. This is an isle of Langerhans right here. It's a cluster of red and blue cells. The red cells are alpha cells, the blue cells are beta cells. Alpha cells produce glucagon, and glucagon is going to increase the release of glucose into the blood system. Into your blood. Beta cells are going to produce insulin, and insulin is going to decrease your blood levels of glucose. So after you eat a meal, you release insulin so you can absorb the glucose. If you're in a state of starvation, you release glucagon so you can release glucose into the tissues. Glucagon, its major target is going to be the liver, where it's going to promote glyconeolysis and gluconeogenesis. Glyconeolysis is the conversion of glycogen to glucose, and gluconeogenesis is going to be the synthesis of glucose from lactic acid and non-carbohydrates. We make lots of glucose and release it into the blood. Insulin is going to lower your blood sugar levels, or blood glucose levels. How? It'll increase membrane transport of glucose into fat and muscle cells. It'll help out with neural development and learning, and it'll inhibit our glyconeolysis and gluconeogenesis. So inhibit the breakdown of glycogen to glucose and the synthesis of glucose from our lactic acid and non-carbohydrates. So with diabetes, it's going to be diabetes mellitus. It's going to be caused due to a hyposecretion or inactivity of glucose, or hypoactivity of glucose. Cardinal signs of diabetes mellitus is the 3 P's: polyuria, polydipsia, and polyphagia. Polyuria, lots of urine. Polydipsia, you're always thirsty. Polyphagia, you're always hungry. Insulin is going to be working in a negative feedback mechanism with its antagonist glucagon. So, let's say I eat a big meal, my sugar levels rise. Since my sugar levels rise, my pancreas releases insulin. Insulin causes my cells to uptake glucose. My liver changes glucose to glycogen, and my sugar levels start to drop. Once my sugar levels start to drop too low, my pancreas is going to stop the release of insulin. And if it drops too low, then we're going to start to release glucagon, which causes glyconeolysis and gluconeogenesis, and we will increase the sugar levels in the blood. With the ovaries and the placenta, the gonads are going to produce our sex hormones. Ovaries are going to make estrogens and progesterones, and the estrogens and progesterones will be responsible for maturation of female reproductive organs, the appearance of secondary female characteristics, and breast development and the cyclic changes within the uterine mucosa. That means the female cycle, the menstrual cycle. The placenta is going to secrete estrogens, progesterone, and HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. That is going to be the hormone that pregnancy tests are looking for oftentimes. Testes. Testes produce testosterone. Testosterone is going to initiate the maturation of male reproductive organs. It's going to cause the appearance of secondary male characteristics and sex drive. It is going to be necessary for sperm production. It will also help with maintenance of the reproductive organs in their functional state. So our other hormone producing structures, we have our heart, which will produce atrionatriuretic peptide. That'll be the hormone that's responsible for reducing our blood pressure. Within our GI tract, we'll have gastrin, secretin, and cholecystokinin. These gastrin will affect the stomach, and it'll stimulate the release of hydrochloric acid to help break down food. And secretin and cholecystokinin, these guys are going to help our liver and our pancreas function properly so we can increase absorption of nutrients and stuff in the small intestines. Kidneys can produce erythropoietin and renin. Erythropoietin is going to signal the production of red blood cells, so start the process of erythropoiesis, production of red blood cells. Renin will do the renin-angiotensin mechanism, which is going to be there to increase our blood pressure. The skin releases cholecalciferol, which is going to be a precursor for vitamin D. And our adipose tissue will produce leptin, which is involved in appetite control, and it'll stimulate increased energy expenditure. Our skeleton, our osteoblasts, can make something called osteocalcin, which is going to prod the pancreatic beta cells to divide and secrete more insulin, which will increase glucose handling and reduce body fat. The thymus makes thymulin, thymopoietins, and thymosins, and they're all going to be involved in the development of T lymphocytes. And that's it for today.